Synth TV.
What's up, everybody? JB here for Synth TV. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a favorite band of mine, Kraftwerk. We're going to be going deep down into the layers, to the prehistory of Kraftwerk, if you like. You know, the official line, if you go and take a look at any of the Kraftwerk box sets, the catalog box sets, or if you go to the Kraftwerk website even, the official party line is that album number 1 is Autobahn. It shows 8 studio albums, and the first album is Autobahn. Well, what if I told you there were actually 3 Kraftwerk albums before Autobahn, and even one proto-Kraftwerk album before those? Mind blown! Does not compute. Does not compute. Oh yeah, we're going to go deep into the history, and that's why we're calling this one Kraftwerk, Electric Archaeology. Before we get started on that, I want to ask you to please subscribe to this channel for more cultural content coming out regularly. Please consider underwriting the efforts. There are links to Patreon, Ko-Fi, merch, etc. below down there. And if you like what you see here, leave us a comment. Let us know what you liked about this video. Leave us a comment and let us know what you'd like to see next. Give this video a thumbs up, share it out, whatever you want to do. Just get the word out about this important information. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, before Autobahn, there were actually 3 albums released as Kraftwerk, but before that there was another album by a group called Organization. Let's go a little bit back in the history. In the late 1960s, Ralf Hutter and Florian Schneider were students at the conservatory in Dusseldorf, and they met and they found kindred spirits in each other, perhaps influenced by, you know, not only the rock and pop music of the day, but the more experimental music that was happening in the classical, quote-unquote, avant-garde at the time, not only of Karlheinz Stockhausen on one side, but Terry Riley and Steve Reich were kind of doing their earliest bits of recordings coming out and little bits of experimentation coming out. And I believe those last 2 that I mentioned there are a big influence on this early Kraftwerk that we're talking about. But the first album was not actually by Kraftwerk. We had an album by a group called Organization. They put out one album called Tone Float. Let's take a look at the cover right here. So Organization was Ralf Hutter on organ, etc. Florian Schneider primarily on flute, as well as Butch Hauff, Fred Monks, and Basil Hamoudi. Basil Hamoudi playing a lot of percussion and hand drums and so forth, and that kind of thing. One thing to notice, I did mention Florian on flute. This early proto-Kraftwerk album and the early first 3 Kraftwerk albums feature quite a bit of flute, probably more than a lot of people realize that flute was a huge part of the early Kraftwerk sound. Florian had this very breathy, percussive style of flute playing that he used quite a bit. A lot of other reviewers compare it to something along the lines of Jethro Tull's Ian Anderson, but I would say it probably goes a little further back than that. Both Ralph and Florian were huge jazz fans back in the day, so I think, you know, Florian's style of flute playing was probably more influenced by Rahsaan Roland Kirk. If you don't know who Rahsaan is, do yourself a favor and check it out, because this is just some wild music. I mean, if you like jazz, and if you like, you know, more kind of outside jazz that's inside at the same time, if you know what I'm talking about, this is something that you'll dig. But back to the main thing we're discussing here, Organization, Tone Float. This album is very much in the kind of late 60s, free-form, free-flowing kind of improvisational madness that was kind of popping up all around Germany in the late 1960s. Now, we're going to take a little detour just for a moment, and we're going to talk about a term that I'm going to be using at various points in this video. And that term is Krautrock. Okay, so it's kind of, it rubs some people the wrong way. I mean, the term in itself was coined, let's say in the 1970s, by British reviewers, English reviewers, talking about all of this new kind of experimental music coming out of Germany. The term doesn't mean much in itself because it's been applied not only to Kraftwerk on one side and Tangerine Dream over here and Faust over here and Guru Guru or things like Amandul or Popol Vuh. You know, it's all kinds of different sounds. And it's just, this is just an umbrella term in the same sense that new wave can't really define one thing. Krautrock doesn't really define anything. So let's move on from there. So looking at this album, Tone Float, in that sort of cultural milieu at the time, it was very much kind of in line with a lot of different things that were happening in Germany. Probably influenced by, because everything has this kind of clattering, cluttered percussion going on, and then things kind of go into these kind of vampy grooves, and there's all these sort of flute and organ things floating over the top. I would compare it to, if you know some of those late 60s Pharoah Sanders albums, The Creator Has a Master Plan, etc., etc. It's not a million miles away from that kind of thing. Again, it's got this kind of groovy thing that, like, I tell you what, if you played this, if you played Tone Float, for just about anyone who says they're a Kraftwerk fan and they know, you know, the classic Kraftwerk sound, and you told them this was Kraftwerk, or at least a proto-Kraftwerk, they'd say, you're insane. There's no way that's possible. But, hey, you know what I'm saying? The evidence is there, you know. So do check this out. Again, if you know Autobahn, and you know the kind of more outside things that happen on side 2 of that album, you know, you may be interested in this album. This may appeal to you, so please do check it out. In any case, organization ended, and then in 1970, it was down to Ralf and Florian, you know, as the core of the group. And they decided to continue on as Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk, again, is German for power plant or power station. And this album, the first Kraftwerk album, the eponymous Kraftwerk album that we see here with the traffic cone on the cover, you know, this was very much in the sort of industrial sound. If we look at what was on the gatefold, this photograph of the power station, it gives you a good indication of what's gonna happen on this album. And let's take just a brief moment and talk about that traffic cone. That traffic cone actually first appeared on the back cover of the original edition of the Organization album. And we see a picture of that here. And it became sort of a symbol for this early Kraftwerk stuff, this traffic cone. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it, you know, this repeating visual motif seems to be indicate an awareness at least, or kind of a gentle sort of movement towards what was happening in pop art. Of course, pop art in the 1960s, you know, Andy Warhol, you know, using the images of mass media and so on and so on. Lichtenstein, whatever, you know, all of these fantastic artists using this, and it seems like Kraftwerk is kind of getting to that a little bit by using this repeated motif, again, of the traffic cone. But let's talk about the album itself. First Kraftwerk album, and we can see it on the cover here. It's actually 4 tunes on here, 4 lengthy tunes, 2 per side. First starts off with Ruckzuck. Ruckzuck is a piece that Organization had actually started performing back in the later days of it, and Kraftwerk took it forward, but actually moved it in a different direction. Boy, you know, this music is kind of unprecedented at the time. It really was something unique and different, the kind of minimalistic rock thing. However, I hear a little bit of the Silver Apples. Anybody out there know about the Silver Apples? Silver Apples, fantastic late 1960s band. It was actually just a duo, right, of a drummer and a gentleman named Simeon on all of this homemade electronic equipment, kind of doing his thing on there, really, kind of set the template for some later things. And this first track with a this kind of simple motif running through it and this kind of drumming makes me think of Silver Apples. And so I always wondered, did these guys know this album? Of course they did. I mean, of course they did. But, it's never been explicitly, acknowledged. But you hear a little bit of that. And again, I made the point about Terry Riley. Again, Terry Riley's album, A Rainbow in Curved Air, came out in the late 1960s and really has a huge influence on these first couple albums. So again, the first album, we have Ruckzuck and Stratovarius on side one. Stratovarius, not spelled like Stradivarius, like the violin maker, but Strat, S-T-R-A-T, perhaps referring to Stratocaster. I mean, there is quite a bit of guitar, electric guitar on these early Kraftwerk albums. So perhaps it's referring to that. I don't know. Side two, we have Megahertz, and then the final track on side two, Von Himmel hoch. Von Himmel hoch, usually translated as From Heaven on High. Von Himmel hoch, of course, is a famous Lutheran hymn that was adapted by Johann Sebastian Bach a number of times and others. Really fantastic piece of music. Does this piece of music have any relationship to the Bach piece? Perhaps not. I don't really hear it, but it sounds like, maybe I'm just reading too much into it, but it does sound like there's bomb sounds at times. So Von Himmel hoch, from heaven on high, from the sky on high. Perhaps it's referring to that. Interestingly enough, we have two drummers on this. On side A of the original, which would be the first two tracks, we have Andreas Hochmann on drums, and on side B, or at least on one track of side B, for Von Himmel hoch, we have Klaus Dinger. And Klaus Dinger is an interesting character, and we'll talk a little bit more about him a little bit later when we talk about Neu. But a fantastic drummer and a wild human being to boot. Interestingly enough, Klaus Dinger came on board because Andreas Hohmann left to go join the band Iblis, I believe it was called, which is another one of these kind of late 60s, early 70s German kind of jamming, jazz, rock sort of bands, which also featured Basil Hammoudi, one of the hand drummers, again, from Organization. So it's kind of a small circle of musicians kind of coming in and out of it. Okay, so after this 1970 recording came out, Ralf actually left the band for a short while. And so it was down to Florian, along with Dinger on drums, Klaus Dinger on drums, and they brought in as well the fantastic Michael Roter on guitar. And we see a little bit of this footage from 1971 of this trio version, which sounds very different, again, from what you might know as the Kraftwerk sound. But again, it sounds very much like what we might think of as the Neu sound. Let's talk about Neu. We're going to do a little brief kind of breakaway right here. Neu was a band that was formed by Michael Roter and Klaus Dinger after they left during this kind of in-between period. And it's very much, it's kind of akin to some of the things that you would hear later on with Kraftwerk. I mean, the drumming that you heard on Von Himmel hoch on the first album has the very distinctive Klaus Dinger beat, which has been kind of retroactively labeled as the motoric beat, which is kind of a it's just kind of this repetitive driving thing. And that was taken to its logical extreme with the band Neu. Neu, N-E-U, exclamation point, is German. Neu is the German word for new, and it kind of grew out of, again, this sort of pop art thing. Neu, of course, you see this all the time in advertisements. New, with an exclamation point, et cetera, et cetera. These are fantastic albums. These are really amazing albums, and I highly suggest you check them out, especially if you like, you know, these early Kraftwerk albums and you like Autobahn. Autobahn shares a lot of things in common with at least the first 2 or 3 Neu albums. There were 3 official albums, 1 semi-official album after that, and some other releases. You can go look into it, but I highly suggest that you check this stuff out because it's really fantastic music. Getting back into this, okay, so after a bit, Ralf rejoined Kraftwerk. So it was back to the duo of Ralf and Florian. Why Ralf wasn't involved in that at that brief period there, there's different accounts. You know, one says that he was finishing his studies, another said he was tired of, you know, performing. I don't know what the reason is, and, you know, there's been no clarification, and there doesn't really need to be. The most important thing is that they joined back together, and we got the second Kraftwerk album, or Kraftwerk 2, or Kraftwerk 2, if you like, and we take a look at this album cover here. And again, we see it's the same album cover, except with the addition of 2, and now the orange traffic cone is green. So again, it does seem to be referring a little bit to pop art and things that were going on in the 1960s as far as the visual art scene. Kraftwerk 2 or Kraftwerk 2 starts off with this long piece, Kling Klang. Kling Klang means like ring sound, like a ring sound, like ding, like a bell ringing sound. It's kind of onomatopoeic in that sense. And it also would give the name to Kraftwerk's studio. Kraftwerk called their home studio Kling Klang Studio. Fantastic stuff. This, you start to really hear, okay, this is becoming the Kraftwerk sound. You know, maybe the first album is like, boy, we're kind of hard pressed because of this grinding noise and kind of free form pounding, you know, but we're starting to hear the sound kind of come together a little bit, especially on this first piece. This first piece uses some drum machine and some keyboard, and it's kind of identifiable, these, you know, these keyboard sounds that Ralf seems to prefer, kind of have these short attacks on them, very well defined. Fantastic piece, goes on a bit long, goes through these different permutations, etc., etc. The side 1 of the vinyl ends with a piece called Atem, or breath, and that's basically what it is. You know, it's the sound of somebody breathing, and so it's like, okay. But if you think about it, you know, you could say it's almost hinting at what would come, you know, decade or so later with Tour de France. The Tour de France single in 1983, of course, was centered around, it starts off with the breathing sound, right? So you could say there's a connection there. Okay, but side 2 of Kraftwerk 2 or Kraftwerk 2, boy, again, it's like there's no real synthesizers on this side. There's no electronics. It's mostly bass and guitar, kind of noisy things, and then kind of jammy, kind of amorphous, kind of, you know, free-flowing things. Again, the adventurous listener will just take this in and say, okay, you know, I either dig it or I don't. But yeah, it doesn't sound hardly anything like what you imagine Kraftwerk to sound like. And that's not a bad thing. You know, it's something really different. But then again, if you listen really, really hard, you know, like the last piece on there, Harmonica, which is a piece based around the sound of a harmonica, or perhaps it's a harmonium, kind of going through this kind of filter and this kind of delay, kind of building up these arpeggiated chords. It's not that different from, let's say, the end of It's More Fun to Compute, or, you know, the Electric Cafe track, how it kind of ends with these kind of arpeggiated chords going up and down. So you could say there's, stylistically, it's pointing towards something, but it feels like, you know, in retrospect, we don't quite have all the pieces in place just yet. The next album, however, Ralf und Florian, Ralf and Florian, very much feels like this is almost, could almost be considered a twin brother to the Autobahn album. This sounds very, very much like Kraftwerk. The early Kraftwerk, sure, but you hear the Kraftwerk sound in this album. It starts off with Elektronische Roulette, or Electronic Roulette, which has a very simple boo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, boo-doo-doo. It's an identifiable Kraftwerk style melody going on here. And it's got that kind of openness, and just things are not quite so cluttered as they are on Kraftwerk 1 and 2. I mean, it's really kind of, you hear the sound being refined. It's just really fantastic. Again, the next tune that we have on there, Tongebirge, or tone, it means like sound range, like range of mountains, not range, statistical range, but range of mountains, like a range of mountain sounds, or sound mountain, sound range, something along those lines. Just, wow, fantastic. Again, I was talking about Terry Riley and that album, Rainbow in Curved Air, which you should really check out if you like this. It's using this delay to kind of build up these sounds. It's something, again, that Robert Fripp and Brian Eno would do later on the No Pussyfooting album with the kind of Frippertronics things, which came right out of Terry Riley, let's be honest about it, and just you hear that sound kind of coming together. The next track, Cristallo. Oh my goodness. Again, Cristallo, you hear it. This is it. You hear dun 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 dun. It sounds very much like any number of later Kraftwerk pieces have their kind of DNA kind of pulled out of this piece. The piece Franz Schubert that goes into Europe Endless on Trans-Europe Express, or the kind of play out of neon lights, or any number of pieces. You hear it. It's right here. This is it. It's coming together and it's coming out. You hear that kind of thing that's kind of a hallmark of Kraftwerk, that kind of those filter sweeps going over these kind of repeated patterns. So the sound is constantly evolving and changing. Beautiful, beautiful. Next piece on this album, Heimatklange, meaning roughly something like sounds of home, or the ringing sounds of home, something along those lines. Basically it's a piece for not piano and flute, but keyboard and flute. It starts off with this kind of additive process that sounds a little bit maybe like, again, maybe Ralph was familiar with Steve Reich's piano phase or something like that, but once it gets going, it reminds me a bit of something neoclassicist from the early 20th century, something like you might hear from a composer such as Paul Hindemith, right? Paul Hindemith, fantastic neoclassicist composer. And interestingly enough, I bring up Paul Hindemith because anyone who knows Paul Hindemith's sonata for piano and flute was a bit of an influence later on for the melody of Tour de France. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please do check it out. And if you knew that, leave me a comment. Hey, we got some serious music fans out here. You know what I'm talking about? In any case, this is another beautiful little piece that leads us into Tanzmusik, or dance music. One of the first Kraftwerk pieces that's explicitly aimed at the dance floor, let's put it like that. We hear the kind of chugging electronic percussion, as well as all of this other kind of percussion over the top, metal and wood things. A bit of clapping, again, maybe Steve Reich again, clapping music, if you're familiar with that piece. Maybe that was influential on this. Some more lovely flute, and the whole album ends up with Ananas Symphony, or Pineapple Symphony. And we hear Florian playing some beautiful, beautiful pedal steel guitar. Boy, not an instrument you associate with Kraftwerk, but it sounds so beautiful. And the chords he's playing are so incredibly beautiful. This piece is absolutely worth the price of admission. Hey, you know what I'm talking about. Now, Kraftwerk always have this kind of very serious kind of, take about them. They always seem very serious and tight-lipped, but there's a lot of humor in Kraftwerk, and it may not be quite so explicit at times, but this album was interesting because of this insert that we're looking at here that came in the original version of an album, which featured these cartoons and drawings by Emil Schult. Emil Schult, longtime associate of the band, who not only helped with the visual design of many of the albums, but also wrote some of the lyrics, right? And so we get these photographs, but we get these interesting cartoons and drawings on here that show a more lighthearted side of these two. And you can see they're starting to get their very kind of stoic, po-faced image together here. Ralf and Florian. I always wondered, Ralf and Florian, again, we've been talking about kind of these kind of streams of modern art going through the early Kraftwerk. I always wondered if Ralf and Florian was somehow a reference to Gilbert and George. Gilbert and George, the conceptual artist, performance artist. I'm not sure how you would define them. That's somebody you should actually look up if you're not familiar with their stuff. Kind of interesting, thought-provoking stuff. And they had these kind of uniforms that they would wear. And again, it's not a million miles away from what Kraftwerk would develop into. But yeah, this is really fantastic. Again, like I'm saying, Ralf und Florian, this particular album, this feels like a Kraftwerk album proper as we know it. It's a little rough around the edges. It's not quite, as defined as it would be, for the next album and going forward. But again, remember, side 2 of the original Autobahn had those very strange pieces on there, as well as quite a bit of Radioactivity is a little bit more on the avant-garde side of things. And Kraftwerk has always maintained those very interesting sonic kind of experiments kind of throughout the stuff, even when they get their most poppiest, right? Even for albums like The Man Machine, etc., there's always those kind of, bits of noise, quote unquote, thrown in there to kind of throw things off guard. So again, I hope you've enjoyed this little look at the prehistory of Kraftwerk. Again, I think these albums are fantastic. I think they're valid, but good luck finding them, man, because these are not officially in print. We've been kind of looking at some of my CDs, etc. here. These are not officially sanctioned CDs. These albums are long out of print. They never officially appeared on compact disc. I mean, you can hear these things. They're up on YouTube, etc., etc. And so it's worth checking out. It's worth the effort if you want to go and hear this stuff. And especially, like I said, if you like those early Kraftwerk albums such as Autobahn and Radioactivity, and you like the more kind of, out there stuff that they get to, at times, you got to go check this out. So please do yourself a favor and dig in deep with this little bit of electric archaeology we've been doing. You know what I'm talking about? We'll catch you next time.
To find out more about all things Kraftwerk, please visit their website and check out the description below this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe to CatSynth TV.
You are watching CatSynth TV.